When I was younger, in my early 20s, I was absolutely terrified at the idea of taking responsibility for my life. And I would do everything I could to avoid taking responsibility. But I was also miserable. What happened was I was on a career path, I was on a particular trajectory in my life where I intended on going down a very specific path that I thought I was aligned with and that I thought I wanted. But when I was honest with myself and I kept stopping and looking at whether or not I had the outcome and the circumstances that I dreamed of, I found that the way I thought things were supposed to look, as opposed to the way they were actually looking, were there was a canyon between the two of them that was so far apart. And so when I stopped and looked at, well, what's going on here? Why are things not progressing as much as I wanted? I realized it's because I haven't done the necessary things and I haven't taken the necessary action to get myself there. And so I had to sit with that because that was a really confronting truth. And it was kind of depressing, to be completely honest, because when I realized that nothing had happened because I hadn't done enough, suddenly I was faced with the reality that it's on me, which revealed that I had this underlying belief that somebody else would pick me up, somebody else would find me or discover me or help me get where I wanted to go without me having to put more work in than anybody else was willing to put in. So I realized I wasn't taking responsibility for my life. I wasn't holding myself accountable to the outcome that I wanted. And when I stopped and looked at all the people that I looked up to at the time, I found, when I was brutally honest with myself, each and every one of them were willing to do the one thing I wasn't willing to do, which was take responsibility for their lives. They looked at their life circumstances and they said, I want a different outcome, or I want this specific outcome. And they took ownership and responsibility of creating that outcome for themselves, rather than sitting back and waiting for the opportunity to come to them. They took ownership, they took action, and they chose to lean right into it. So I want to talk about the importance of taking 100% responsibility for your life, because all the changes and everything that you're trying to create for yourself, the future that you're trying to create as well, none of that will happen unless you take responsibility. And so here, right now, the purpose of all of this is to encourage you to take ownership and be honest with yourself, because you're having to actually look within and ask yourself, how much am I waiting for someone else to come along and solve the problem? No one's going to do it. Here's where things got really interesting for me. I realized that I was reflecting and feeling really uncomfortable about my circumstances. But then when I stopped and looked at what were the underlying beliefs that I was carrying, one of them was that I was waiting for someone else to pick me, for someone to come along and say, wow, you're really special. You're really talented. You're incredible. Let me take you and pop you up on this particular platform or this particular stage or in front of this particular audience. And it wasn't happening. It just wasn't. And it wasn't meant to, because I had bought into this idea that that's how things happened. But in reality, that those circumstances happened one in however many million. They were so rare. But for the majority of the people that were making something of themselves, it wasn't because somebody had come along. It was because they made something of themselves. There's a hint in that language, in that phrase, making something of themselves. They were taking action. It wasn't somebody making something of them. It was they were making something of themselves. They took ownership of it. And it's uncomfortable as hell. Nobody wants to do it. For the majority of the people that I work with, one of the main reasons why people get stuck is because they're not taking responsibility of whatever area of their life that they're getting stuck in. Whether it's a relationship, especially with finances, and you best believe that it's true for business too. And then we also see that occur in health. People abdicating responsibility for their health to healthcare professionals and not taking the advice from these professionals and then going and educating themselves, especially this day and age. So it's a matter of taking responsibility. I love this equation that I got from the book The Success Principles by Jack Canfield. And I believe he got this equation from a psychotherapist in Los Angeles who shared this wonderful equation of E plus R equals O. What he says is E is event, R is response, and O is the outcome. So the event plus your response equals the outcome. Now, most people try to change the event, the external circumstances, the external experience, but the response is what you actually have control over. So if you're trying to change the outcome in this algorithm or in this formula, and the only thing you truly have control over is your response, then instead of spending all your time and energy on trying to change the external circumstances, you're best to change your internal response. How you respond to the circumstances will ultimately change the outcome, which ties beautifully into the word responsibility. It means ability to respond instead of react, because most people spend their lives having a reaction, reliving some past emotion and staying stuck in that cycle where they're not able to break themselves out of it. And they constantly repeat the same thing over and over again, and the same patterns and the same cycles, and they can't seem to break out of it. It's because they're reacting. They're not responding. And so when you're taking responsibility for your life, you are saying to yourself, you're declaring to yourself, I have the ability to respond to this as opposed to react. And I'm choosing to take ownership over this rather than waiting for life to hand me the opportunity of a lifetime on a silver platter under a wonderful cloche. It's not going to happen. There's no butler for life, unfortunately. It's up to you. It's up to us to take responsibility. I'll give you an example of this. Many years ago, I was working with a client who was recently divorced from her husband, and it was a really challenging time. And what was difficult for her was that when he was looking after their daughter, he would call her while she was at work. Now, she had a job. She was a single mother now. She needed to work, and she also really loved her career. So going to work was important for her. And so she'd get these calls, and then she'd text me saying, I'm overwhelmed with anxiety right now. I can't seem to control it. And I asked her what was going on, what was creating so much anxiety. She said, well, my ex is calling me. And I just had a conversation with him, and he's gotten me really worked up, and now I feel anxious at work, and it was over something trivial. It wasn't even important. I'm like, okay, why did you answer the call? She said, what do you mean? He called me. I said, but why did you answer? She's like, I don't know how to answer that question. I just did. I said, that's the problem. See, the thing is, you were at work and he called you. Did you have to answer the call? She's like, well, I felt like I had to because he's got our daughter and he messaged me an hour before that asking me a question about her. So I just assumed that I had to because if something's up, I need to know. Like, okay, that's fair. But why not tell him to text you before he calls? Hey, it's urgent when I call. Can you answer? Or hey, it's important when I call. Can you answer? She's like, I suppose I haven't really thought about that. I'm like, yeah, you're not taking responsibility of the dynamic. When you answer the phone call, you've got no idea what's going to be on the other end of that call. And he calls to talk about trivial stuff, which pulls her away from her work, which impacts her performance. And then she gets criticized at work for it, which creates all this anxiety. And I said, you don't have to answer the call. Take responsibility of that because you can't control him. You cannot control whether he calls or not. You cannot control whether he messages you, but you can control whether or not you respond and whether or not you answer. She's like, as obvious as that sounds, it never occurred to me that I didn't have to answer his calls. And so she stopped answering his calls. He would call and she wouldn't answer. And she would text back saying, if this is important, let me know. Otherwise, I can speak at this time or whatever time. And after a couple of times and instances of him doing that, the circumstances changed, the dynamic changed. And he stopped calling her when he knew he was at work. And instead he would wait. And if it was urgent, he would text her and change the whole behavioral pattern. So when we take responsibility for our circumstances, we start to change the dynamic around us and we create circumstances for ourselves that we genuinely align with. I'll give you another personal example. When I was in the early stages of launching my business as a coach and building my career down the path that I'm now on, I was really uncomfortable with the idea of selling myself and promoting my services and letting people know that I was a coach for a number of different reasons, but they were all fear. And as a result, I was hoping that other people would market my services. I was hoping that other people would talk about me instead of me letting people know that I was available to help them. And so because of that approach, it took a while for me to build my business, at least initially, to the point where I had enough people talking about me actually doing the word of mouth thing that it was working in my favor. What I realized was that I needed to work through these fears because the revenue just wasn't coming in and I couldn't sustain this particular path. So I took ownership, I took responsibility and said, well, I'm asking other people to be responsible for the marketing of my business, but these people don't work in my business. So I had to take responsibility and work through those fears that were holding me back, working through the fear of rejection and criticism and having people close to me having opinions of me that made me uncomfortable. And so by working through that and taking responsibility of my circumstances and my own fears and the business, then I felt more comfortable talking about how I could help people in different circumstances. And as a result, when I did that, the speed of the growth of the business expanded significantly compared to how slowly things were moving before that. And ironically, by me doing that, me taking ownership of marketing my services and telling people how I can solve problems and help, other people started talking about it. So the thing that I hoped people would do, they weren't doing when I wasn't taking responsibility. But the moment I started taking responsibility, people got into action and they started talking about my services. That's the irony of this. When we're willing to take responsibility for our lives, that's when the opportunities we're hoping for start to show up. It's the biggest unlock that people miss. And it was one that I certainly missed early in my career. I'll give you another personal example where this has been the case for me. Again, in my early 20s, my late teens, early 20s, my finances were a mess. I had a large amount of consumer debt. I had barely any savings. I was financially illiterate and I was not actively doing anything to change my financial circumstances. I was just kept living the way I was living without really questioning the way I was doing things financially. And when I inspected the underlying beliefs, I realized that there was a part of me that was waiting for some big payday to come in the future. And it wasn't based on any factual information that I had that there was a big payday coming. It was just some kind of fantasy I had in my mind that money would come down the pipeline. I would get paid more at some point, or I would get some kind of promotion, or somebody would reward me with money or something like that. And I was imagining this future where that money would come through and it would solve the problems. In fact, there were a number of years that I was kind of counting on my tax return because I was an employee earlier in my life. I was counting on my tax return actually being that little bump, that lump sum that I would get that would solve the financial decisions I was making throughout the entire financial year. And so I was kind of banking on these lump sum amounts coming through, but the reality is they didn't come through because I was waiting for them. And so my financial circumstances perpetuated, they didn't change. And so it wasn't until I realized that I had that belief, and then I looked at how irresponsible that was in the literal sense of the word, that I was not taking responsibility for my finances, that I looked at the circumstances and said, well, okay, what do I do? What would I do if I was somebody who took responsibility for my life and my financial situation? And what I discovered when I looked at other people and what they did was that they made themselves financially literate. So they went and studied and learned all the different understandings of financial literacy and personal finances. And they studied investing, they studied savings, and they implemented budgets and ran their own budgets. So instead of delegating their money to somebody else to run, they got an understanding of their own money first before they delegated it. So they knew what they were delegating, and they knew that what running their money well looked like and what running their money poorly looked like. So they had to take ownership of it. So I said, okay, well, I've got to do that. So I started digging into as much information as I could about financial literacy and getting a deep understanding of it. And everything I was learning was just a new epiphany for me. I'm like, holy crap, how was I not taught this earlier? And so by learning all these different things, it started to help me empower myself. And it was painful as hell because I was having to confront all the different decisions that I was making throughout my life. But every single one of them was helping me totally empower myself. I realized no one's coming to save me. No one's coming to educate me on this. I have to put my hand up and learn. I have to put my hand up and go and implement. I have to go and take action. So I implemented a budget. I started changing my spending habits. I started spending or living within my means instead of overextending myself using debt and paying back the debt to the best of my ability. And the irony, when I started taking ownership of my financial circumstances, that's when different financial opportunities came into my life that involved some higher lump sum payments of a couple of $1,000s here, a couple of $1,000s there, which all helps me continue to build my savings and pay down my debt. Today, my financial circumstances are dramatically different to where they were back then. And it's not because somebody saved me or someone rescued me. In fact, the opposite happened. I had to take ownership. I had to rescue myself. And then the opportunity started to come through, which helped propel me along my journey. There was a saying that one of my teachers taught me years ago, John DeMartini, and he said, when you take ownership of your finances, when you take responsibility, then more opportunities will come to you. And that unlocked something for me when I realized I've been doing this backwards this whole time. I was waiting for the lump sum to solve the financial problem when in reality it required me taking action first and then life responding to my action. Which reminds me of this other quote that I heard from a business mentor many, many years ago. He said, life rewards action. So we wait for life to give us the opportunity before we take action, but it happens the other way around. It requires us to take action and then life responds to the action that we're taking because our actions are a declaration. It's almost like we're saying something to life or to the universe. Like, hey, I'm doing this, but I want you to understand I'm not just talking about it. Here is a demonstration of my commitment to taking ownership of this. And then that's when the opportunities start coming in. So if I can encourage you, please take ownership of your life. No one can live your life for you. No one. I can't live it for you. I can give you guidance. I can give you insight, but I can't come in for your day and live your life for you. And if I did, I'd probably make a mess of it because I don't understand the nuances of your entire experience. No one's going to live your life for you. So take ownership, take responsibility. And I know it's scary, but the reality is you do it little by little every day. What's another way that I can take responsibility today? What's another way that I can take responsibility for my life or this particular area of my life? And if you're feeling challenged in a particular moment, ask yourself, how can I take responsibility of this situation in this moment? And it may be that you've got to have a hard conversation with somebody. It may be that you've got to inquire about something. It may be that you've got to ask somebody for help, for guidance. That's still you taking responsibility because you're saying, I want this circumstance to change. I'm not waiting for someone to come to me to tell me how to do things. And believe me, the more you do that, if you just dedicate a whole year to doing that, the amount of evidence that you will accumulate that taking responsibility is actually empowering and it's not scary, it will lock that behavior in. It will lock that habit in. And you won't want to change it. You'll just want to continue to take responsibility for your life. And I'll give you this last little tidbit. For those of you that are taking responsibility already, and for those of you who are on that journey, when you do, when you fully embody taking responsibility for your life, it will become incredibly obvious just how little people around you are taking responsibility for their lives. It is not your job to save them, to rescue them, or to recruit them into an experience where they're taking responsibility. That's their journey. Because you will be fighting an uphill battle, and it's essentially like you having to walk through a city with a megaphone screaming, you need to take responsibility, you need to take responsibility. Most people, I say most, I haven't met everybody, so it's an arbitrary comment, but when I look around and I experience a lot of interactions with a lot of strangers asking for my help, a lot of the challenges people face is because they're not taking responsibility for your life. Do that one thing consistently for the rest of your life. If you don't remember anything else that I've said and you just do that one thing, I promise you your life will change. It's profound, the amount of impact that that one thing can have. So, my hope is that I have inspired you to start taking responsibility in your life and look at different areas of your life where you may be avoiding responsibility and look at the symptoms or the circumstances of that area of your life. And you'll find wherever you're having challenges is because there's a lack of responsibility on your part. So take ownership, step forward, go create a different future for yourself. You deserve it. Thanks for being here. Got a lot of love for you. I appreciate you being here. And make sure you check out our other videos and other content because we've got some really cool stuff coming out. I'm Giorgio. I'll see you next time.